Okay, so now we have discussed briefly some of the basic concepts in the study of logic. Let's now go to the next issue, which has to do with propositions. In my previous discussion, I've used the word propositions, and a number of listeners want to know what a proposition is. Now, logicians tend to differentiate between sentences and propositions for a very good reason. Because in English, there are different types of sentences. You have sentences that are used for asking questions. Those are called interrogative sentences. For instance, who are you? There are those that are used for expressing emotions, exclamatory sentences. My goodness. There are other sentences that are used to issue command. They are called imperative sentences. Get out of this class. In fact, there are performative sentences. In other words, sentences that perform the act contained in the sentence itself. For example, when a priest is officiating in a wedding and he says, with this ring, I do the word. The priest is not describing anything. He is actually performing the very act enunciated in the sentence. Now, but there is a very important category of sentences that form the central focus for logicians. They are called declarative sentences. These are sentences that are used for expressing information. For instance, the economy of Nigeria today is bad. Nigerians, the masses of Nigerians are suffering. The weather is too hot. 2 plus 2 is 4. These are the kinds of statements that form the central focus of logicians. They are used to convey information. And why do logicians differentiate? Why do they insist that propositions are better than using the word sentences? Why? Apart from the fact that there are different types of sentences and the logicians are interested generally in the narrow aspect of sentence, that's the sentences that convey information, you discover that there's an ambiguity in sentences. Take, for example, supposing I say Bertrand Russell is the greatest philosopher, and I say the greatest philosopher is Bertrand Russell. We are saying the same thing, but the sentences are not the same. It is that sameness of meaning, what we technically call in logic the information content, that logicians describe with the word proposition. Okay, consider a situation where we say the same thing in different languages, which means we are saying the same thing in different sentences. For example, we say, Obodo Nigeria buru ibu. Ìlú Nigeria tóbi. Nigeria is a big country. Nigeria Baba Kasane. I've said the same thing in Igbo, Yoruba, English, and Hausa. But I'm saying the same thing. That same thing I'm saying is what logicians will describe as propositions. Then lastly, supposing I've eaten a sumptuous meal of fried rice and salad, and I'm filled up. And I come to my class and tell the students that, pointing to myself, I say, I am hungry. And I say, I am hungry. And then there's a student who has not even had breakfast. And it's already evening. And the student actually quoted what I said by saying, I am hungry. We have said the same thing in the same language, but the proposition is different. Why is it different? Because in the instance in which I said I am hungry, I'm actually not telling the truth because I'm well fed. But the student who are not eating, who says I am hungry, is telling the truth. Whereas my own I am hungry is false, her own I am hungry is true. And yet it's the same sentence, but different propositions. Why is it different propositions? Because if you replace the first person pronoun I, in the first instance, it means Professor Douglas Anele. In the second instance, the I replaces the name of the student, making the assertion. Therefore, logicians find it convenient to talk about propositions instead of sentences. Although some logicians prefer statements, I personally prefer the word proposition. And one of the reasons why I prefer it is not just the way it sounds, but because it is not very common among people. So now that we have done this, let's now go to the next topic, which is the types of arguments. Arguments in logic can be divided into two broad categories. On the one hand, you have deductive arguments. On the other hand, you have inductive arguments. Similarly, you have formal logic and you have informal logic. In general, formal logic deals with deductive arguments. In general, I'm not saying that formal logic does not deal with inductive arguments, no. But generally, formal logic is dominated by deduction, whereas inductive logic is dominated by inductive arguments. Now, there are two ways of looking at both deductive arguments and inductive arguments. Following the traditional Aristotelian logic, a deductive argument is an argument that begins with general or universal propositions as premises and ends with a particular proposition as conclusion. I repeat, a deductive argument, according to the Aristotelian tradition, typically begins with a universal proposition or propositions as premises and a particular proposition as conclusion. Take, for example, the first argument I used. All humans are mortal. Obi is human. Therefore, Obi is mortal. This is a typical instance of a deductive argument because it begins with what? All humans are mortal. That's a universal or general proposition. And it ends with Obi is mortal. That's a particular proposition. Indeed, there are innumerable arguments that follow this Aristotelian pattern. In other words, there are innumerable deductive arguments that begins with universal proposition as premises and then ends up with a particular proposition as conclusion. But then, there are also many arguments that do not follow the typical Aristotelian definition of deductive arguments. Take, for example, all elements are made up of atoms. All atoms are made up of subatomic particles. Therefore, all elements are made up of subatomic particles. This is a typical deductive argument. Universal propositions as premises, universal proposition as conclusion. Also, a deductive argument can have particular propositions throughout. For instance, a bachelor is an unmarried man. Kingsley is a bachelor. Therefore, Kingsley is an unmarried man. Particular premises, particular conclusion. Remember, general proposition or universal propositions are propositions of the type all this is that. Every this is that. Anything that is this is also that. No this is that. Nothing is this and that. These kinds of propositions are called general or universal propositions. So you can see that from the examples I've just presented now, a deductive argument can follow the traditional Aristotelian pattern or definition, and it may also not follow it. The same scenario plays out in inductive arguments. That is to say, there are inductive arguments that actually begin from particular propositions as premises and end with general proposition as conclusion. That is the Aristotelian traditional definition of inductive argument. That an inductive argument is an argument that begins with a particular proposition or propositions as premises and ends up with a universal proposition as conclusion. But I've just said that, like what happens in deductive arguments, there are propositions that do not conform to the Aristotelian pattern. But before we look at them, let me give you one that conforms. Ihuoma is Igbo and hardworking. Ebere is Igbo and hardworking. Ijeoma is Igbo and hardworking. Kalu is Igbo and hardworking. Therefore, probably all Ndi Igbo are hardworking. You can see the flow of the reasoning, beginning from particular propositions where individual names are mentioned, then going to a general conclusion, or what we call generalization. And I can tell you that if you open any textbook of logic, you will see arguments that follow the Aristotelian pattern. But there are others that do not. In other words, there are inductive arguments, genuine inductive arguments, that actually contain general propositions throughout. And there are some that contain particular propositions throughout. Take, for example, all generals are powerful and arrogant. All pastors are powerful and arrogant. All ministers are powerful and arrogant. Therefore, probably all powerful people are arrogant. So you can see, this is a typical inductive argument. The premises are general propositions. The conclusion is a general proposition. On the other hand, you can also have an inductive argument that contains particular propositions throughout. Take, for example, Ahmed Musa A foreign-based professional footballer is wealthy. Alex Iwobi, a foreign-based professional footballer, is wealthy. Odion Igalo, a foreign-based professional footballer, is wealthy. Iheanacho, a foreign-based professional footballer, is wealthy. Ndidi is a foreign-based professional footballer. Therefore, probably Ndidi is wealthy. So all these are particular propositions, both as premises and as conclusion. And yet, it is an inductive argument, but it does not follow the Aristotelian pattern. So we have seen that the nature of the premises and the conclusion in terms of whether a particular proposition is universal or particular does not determine whether an argument is deductive or inductive. In other words, the Aristotelian criteria for defining or differentiating between deductive and inductive arguments do not apply in all cases. So, how then do modern logicians differentiate between deductive and inductive arguments? How? In general, modern logicians affirm that in order to differentiate appropriately, one has to look at the relation, the nature of the relation that arose between the premises and the conclusion of a specific argument in order to determine whether it is inductive or deductive. For modern logicians, as I said earlier, one has to look closely at the nature of the relation affirmed in the argument or by the argument between the premises and the conclusion in order to ascertain whether a particular argument is deductive or inductive. For deductive arguments, the nature of the relation is so strict, is so tight, such that if it is a valid argument, once you accept the premises, you are bound logically to accept the conclusion. In other words, in a valid deductive argument, the truth of the premises entail the truth of the conclusion. And then, very importantly, if you look at every deductive argument, there's an underlying presumption that the premises provide conclusive grounds for the conclusion. I repeat this. In a typical deductive argument, the premises purport to provide conclusive grounds for the conclusion, which means that if it is a valid deductive argument, once you accept the premises as true, you are bound logically to accept the conclusion as true also. Whereas the relation between the premises and the conclusion of an inductive argument is typically that of probability. In fact, that is why when I was giving examples of inductive arguments, when it comes to the conclusion, I use the word probability, which means that the relationship between the premises and the conclusion of an inductive argument is not as strict, is not as tight as that which obtains in a deductive argument simply because the premises of an inductive argument provide some support, but not conclusive grounds for the conclusion, which means that the premises may be true, the premises of an inductive argument may be true, but the conclusion could be false. So the issue here is that the relationship between the premises and conclusion of a deductive argument is more logically rigorous, more logically strict, or if you like, logically stricter than the relationship between the premises and the conclusion of a typical inductive argument.